Live once again. Very happy to be here again, talking about all the crazy stuff that's going on in the world. As usual, I will make my usual pitches for Counterpunch. Counterpunch Plus is the subscriber section. That's where you can go and subscribe and support Counterpunch and support a lot of the great work that comes out there. You can also go to my Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser, for a lot of exclusive content, as well as stuff that's available on the YouTube channel. If you're watching this on YouTube, Facebook, wherever else, please consider it, and consider supporting our friends. And I have one of my friends with me today. It's Alex Gendler. Alex is a Brooklyn-based writer and freelancer. He's been published in many different places. I would recommend following Alex on social media. Alex has a lot of experience, including experience in Ukraine, and a pretty well-rounded perspective on everything that's going on vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. So I definitely wanted to talk with Alex tonight. Alex, welcome.
Hey, Eric, great to be here again.
Yeah, so I mean, where do we start, Alex? What do you think? I mean, we haven't talked since Prigozhin's March, or whatever it's going to be called in the annals of weirdo history. So what do you make of this whole situation? We'll dive into some more details here in a second, but your general perspectives.
Yeah. I'm curious to see what clever names there will be for this event. I haven't seen that many yet, but no, it's really. I mean, like, just on a personal note, I was upstate for ironically, like a mostly Russian, like post-Soviet kind of Burning Man music festival ish that's put together by like the Soviet diaspora. So very limited reception, and then occasionally I was catching Wi-Fi, and I started getting these messages of like that there's a coup happening in Russia, and that Wagner is literally marching a column of tanks through Rostov, and is like 150 kilometers out of Moscow. And I was just like getting these snippets throughout the day, so it was just like holy crap, picked a hell of a weekend to be out of town. But yeah, I mean, and so it was just interesting to experience it at the place where I was, because pretty much everyone there was Russian speaking, or Russian speaking, or from the former Soviet states. Oh, we've got questions here. I don't know. Wait, Eric, your sound is cut out now.
Yeah, well, that's what happens when you mute yourself and then forget to unmute yourself. So, yeah, so I'll put it up there. We did just get a question. I'd ask you to return to talking about your weekend and what happened, but here we did get a question. Don't you think Russia is going to completely destroy Ukraine? Russia has more artillery and more men, therefore they will win this war. Well, I'll throw that one to you, Alex. What do you think?
I mean, that doesn't sound like a really serious question. Wars depend on a lot more factors, and obviously there's a lot of outside aid coming to both sides. So, and that's not really what we're talking about right now, anyway. But yeah, no, it was interesting getting this news there with like kind of limited reception. Everyone else was kind of also sort of, this news was trickling into this like sort of escapist event, and everyone there was either Russian speaking or from just generally from the region. So there was a lot of kind of, and it's generally a pretty progressive crowd. So pretty much everyone there, at least those who speak about it publicly, opposed the invasion, opposed Putin. And there was this weird sort of disconnect, because obviously Prigozhin is probably one of the worst people in the world. But there was this sort of muted excitement, like, how far is it going to go? Could this really be the end of Putin? And I think, when it comes to developments in Russia, I've learned, and I think a lot of Russians and Russian speakers, both inside and outside the country, have learned not to get their hopes up for things getting better or things going well. So, there was like a little bit of a disappointment when it just sort of was completely aborted. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to look at kind of how the pieces get picked up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to know a little bit more about some of the attitudes of the people that you were with at the festival, since it's, people, I guess, generally youngish people born or raised in Eastern Europe or came over at a young age, or maybe, I guess, some probably born here to immigrant parents and such. But I would assume that there would be a general antipathy towards both Prigozhin and Putin among such a crowd. But I wonder what divides there were. I mean, were there serious leftists versus typical liberals? Was there a kind of representative liberal opposition type perspective on this versus what, the kind of perspective you and I might have? How did that break down?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like a political festival. The festival's called Jet Lag, by the way. There was some like coverage of it last year because that was the first festival that was happening sort of in the shadow of this war, and they had to change a lot of stuff kind of last minute. Usually they have a lot of artists from Russia and from Ukraine and from other places. And so last year there was sort of a lot of last minute changes. A lot of the artists that were booked couldn't get out. And there's been sort of a lot of kind of the kind of soul searching that I think has been happening in a lot of like post-Soviet cultural things, even about the term post-Soviet, right? And sort of the sort of presumption of Russian is still used as a lingua franca in these communities, even if no one at the table is from Russia. You have someone from Ukraine and someone from Kazakhstan, someone from Georgia, someone from wherever. What the Russian is what they're going to use among themselves, unless they use English. So I mean, yeah, I think there's just generally sort of a general consensus, like sort of support Ukraine. They're donating a portion of the proceeds to relief efforts, that kind of thing. I don't think there were like that many. I don't think whatever political divides there are didn't really have a chance to. It was just people kind of listening to sometimes cheesy music, and yeah. There were some of like the old school like Russian rock stars, like the guy from Akvarium played this year. That was like one of the big Russian rock bands even during the Soviet era. Yeah, so I mean it was just kind of weird to get that news in that setting.
Well, the reason I ask is because there was a very strange kind of divide among what you would call the liberal opposition, the non-Marxist, non-communist, non-real leftist type of opposition to Putin. The divide really broke down between people who kind of sat on their hands and didn't want to say anything, and some who, I wouldn't say were in love with what Prigozhin was doing, but were definitely happy to see a sort of a destabilization of Putin's state. And so I wonder, well, first of all, what do you make of those kinds of divides? And what does that tell us, to the extent that it tells us anything, about the liberal opposition, both within Russia and, of course, much of it now outside of Russia?
Yeah, it is strange. Like I didn't really follow a lot of like the domestic Russian reaction. Like mostly what I saw was the sort of social media posts coming out of Rostov, where people were just like, sort of really, and I mean, this is definitely what I like. It really like Baudrillard and before him, losing the name, Society of the Spectacle,
Guy Debord.
Yeah, like just completely like people were treating it as a spectacle. They were just like, look, there's tanks rolling in the street. Wonder what this is about. And then you were like taking selfies with them and stuff. And that was most of the reaction I saw. I mean, and then by the time I got back, there was also the sort of like post-mortem discussion, which I guess is also what we're doing here. I mean, I think definitely there's. I think one of my friends put it well. It's during the height of it, when they were literally going towards Moscow, as one of my friends put it, Russia's about to have a civil war that's a white army on all sides.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that brings us to another issue that I wanted to discuss with you. Alexander Zamyatin, who is a well-known Russian leftist, he wrote several interesting commentaries on this, but one of the points that he made that I think is really important to sort of dig into a little bit is the fact that what you really saw was two forces in competition with each other, the forces of Prigozhin on the one hand and the forces of Putin and the state on the other hand. And the fact is, there was no third force. There was no democracy representation. There was no mass social base for something other than these two. It's part of the reason why it seems that people sat on their hands and kind of waiting to see how things were going to play out, which is different than you've had at other historical epochs. I mean, the obvious one is 1917. You know, a lot of people made reference to 1917 for various reasons.
When, Prigozhin himself included.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, and in 1917, there was that third force. There was an industrial worker base. There was a social base. There was actual political forces outside of, you know, the whites and such. Right. So what do you make of this situation now where Russia finds itself basically without any democracy force at all to counter any of this? Because it's been, you know, systematically dismantled over the years. Many of those have been jailed or gone abroad, etc. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, this is just the fact that this sort of thing could happen. It really couldn't happen any other place but Russia, but modern Russia, and it shows kind of what kind of a weird sort of, I would say, like, what sort of weird strange category of political order, and which is just something that people like Russia commentators and analysts have like struggled to define. Like, what is Russia? Is it a fascist state? Is it a totalitarian, authoritarian state? Is it neoliberal? Is it state capitalist? Like, what is it? And this, because, you know, whatever it is, we know it's not democratic, it's not socialist, it's not there is basically one thing that has often been noted that Putin has done is basically like demobilize civil society, like eliminate civil society completely and demobilize the population. Basically, populations, mass majority of populations completely checked out of politics. What's going on? There's sort of a deep, like, baseline cynicism. Nothing will ever change. Don't waste your time even like worrying about this stuff. And in the wake, what has emerged is kind of like, it's almost funny because this like little stunt, which is like shocking to us in the modern world. How the hell do you openly wage a military rebellion, literally shoot down, you know, what was it, 5 helicopters, killed something like 15 army members, basically threatened to come within 100 kilometers of threatening to advance on the capital, and then it's just like as if nothing ever happened, and it's all over, nothing to see here. But the funny thing is, this kind of thing actually used to happen all the time in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, right? This was actually like Roman Empire, I think even like Imperial China during periods, feudal Europe. This was sort of par for the course because it was just, you know, you had these competing warlords, large property owners. In Rome, it was, you know, senators that were supposedly serving, you know, the same empire, but had their own private lands, were able to raise their own armies, were always kind of in like actual violent competition with each other. And that you would have these kinds of like demonstrations of force that are because these sorts of demonstrations of force were how diplomacy and politics were done before sort of the...
Maybe Russia really is the third Rome.
Right. Yeah. Not in the way they intended, or maybe, yeah. But
for people who don't get that reference, that's part of the Russian sort of state mythology, that Russia is the inheritor of the legacy of Rome and Constantinople, that Moscow represents the quote-unquote third Rome, the defender of Christianity, etc.
Right. Yeah, which Putin has definitely leaned into, the whole idea that they're defending Christian values against the degenerate globalist West. But yeah, so it's kind of almost harks back to before the emergence of like the modern state, which above all else is defined by having a monopoly on violence, right? And this, whatever else happens with this has shown that Putin does not have a monopoly on violence, even within his own borders.
Well, and actually, that's a statement that Podolyak, Zelensky's advisor, made almost exactly verbatim what you just said, that the monopoly on violence, the myth of the monopoly on violence has been busted in Russia, right? Obviously, from the Ukrainian perspective, they're playing a little psychological warfare here, trying to sort of, drive the wedge even further in the divides within the Russian elite. But I want to touch on something else with you, Alex, that I think is really important. And I frankly, I don't know that it's being discussed nearly enough. And that is the fact that you basically had a situation where nobody had support. Prigozhin is marching with 25,000 armed and veterans of really vicious fighting. Okay, you have at the same time a massive military. Russia has a massive military infrastructure. They have massive numbers. It's a massive country, and in this confrontation with this extremely dramatic and theatrical march with tanks, all of this, right? Nobody really came out. Nobody came out in support. Prigozhin, in my view, definitely had no interest in marching on Moscow once he realized people were not flooding the streets for him. People were not flooding the streets for Wagner, nor were people flooding the streets in defense of the state. Most of society looked like they were kind of just sitting around and waiting to see who would win and what would happen. And I think that, more than anything else, really undermines Putin and Putin's structures within the state. How can that be? After all of these years, you have no real popular support in the streets at a moment of potential coup d'etat?
Well,
think about Chavez, Hugo Chavez, in 2002, when George Bush and the Bush administration backed the attempted overthrow against Chavez. Hundreds of thousands poured into the streets, into the plazas, into the main squares, demanding Chavez be returned. It was popular outcry over yet another U.S. orchestrated coup. And in Russia, where you really did see a potential march on the Capitol, nothing.
yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. My take is, this kind of speaks to what I was saying before about Putin. I think the sort of governance model that Putin has promulgated over his 2 decades in power is not the same one as Chavez or a lot of other what we call populist leaders, because Putin's whole thing was, like I said, demobilizing civil society. And he did not. I mean, there's a very vague sense in which he relies on popular support through, manipulated elections, and these sort of passive opinion polls that are 80% of the country support Putin and whatever. Which, I think you yourself have talked about how there's complications with those numbers. But one thing that was never a part of Putin's sort of power model structure was this idea of getting masses out in the streets to show their support for the motherland. There were some the Nashi, the youth groups. There's some, but those are minuscule numbers. This is not. Putin does not, above all, does not want people in the streets, even to support him. That's just not that's not sort of the model that he operates with. And I think part of this, you can say, has to do with him being a former KGB man. Whereas Chavez, for example, he had this sort of the popular neighborhood organizations and stuff that just a very I think a very different model. And I think that sort of speaks to the sort of state that Russia is, where it is basically a sort of, and I don't think Prigozhin was counting on that either, on masses of popular support, people coming out in the streets. This is all basically an intra elite game. I think, if anything, what Prigozhin was counting on was might have been sort of a probing, an invitation to see what other oligarchs, what other allies of his might have come out to support him. And I think, once it was maybe the lack of that, and seeing that everyone either kept silent or took Putin's side, all the people who mattered, once that happened, that was when Prigozhin kind of sort of abandoned the gamble.
Yeah. Tavish has that comment. I agree, Tavish. Support for Putin and Russia seems more like cynical or apathetic support. Alex, you know more about Russia and Russian society probably than I do, and your Russian language skills are better than mine. So how do you read it?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. There's very, um, you can find people who are just gushing about Putin or whatever, but there's generally the sorts of the sort of like average Russian citizen is basically like a shrug. Is like, yeah, I know he's corrupt, but they're all corrupt, and he's keeping it, he's keeping the country together, and people respect us. Yeah, I'm sure he's, and like they know about it. People like Russians aren't just like they're not ignorant, they're not stupid, they're extremely cynical, and a whole bunch of other things. But people know about the palaces, people know about like the just $100,000 Rolexes or whatever. Like they know about that stuff. It's just like they have absorbed the Russian society on a large scale has absorbed the idea. This is just how it is. This is just how power is. This is the only way it can be. Any attempt to make things better actually just makes it worse. And anyone who believes in like things like democracy or revolution or human rights is kind of a fool, and they're being played.
I want to put up another comment here. It's kind of a long one. We got, I guess, several parts to it, but I think it's worth addressing. So apparently, Executive Secretary of the Ukrainian pacifist movement, Yuri Zhelazhenko, wrote to Democracy Now!, quoted, I think the main lesson of the Wagner mutiny is that Russian militarists, including even war criminals like Putin and Prigozhin, are capable of negotiating and stopping bloodshed. This is an additional argument why it's not only necessary for humanitarian reasons, but also it must be possible to cease fire in Ukraine and start peace talks, not prolong the war for multiple decades. And then just a final part so I can get all of the comment here. I'm curious about this. Is it just a moot point? Thank you for that question, comment, Nick. I guess I'll open it to you, Alex. I have some things to say about Yuri and some of his positions that he's taken. So go ahead, Alex.
I mean, yeah. I'm aware. I'm familiar with Yuri. Like, I think he's kind of just been saying the same thing since, even since 2014, and kind of regardless of developments of the ground. And I mean,
clarify that, Alex. Clarify. You mean saying the same thing, meaning negotiate?
Yeah, and it's. I mean, to his credit, it's a consistent pacifist position that's just against militarism and violence in any circumstance, regardless of the conditions on the ground. But the fact is that he's coming from the Ukrainian side, and this is directed at the pro-Ukrainian side. There's really no, because pacifist activists in Russia tend not to be heard or to go to jail. I mean, this is sort of just playing the same note that a lot of the sort of quote unquote anti-imperialist left, and that Western military to Russia is quote unquote prolonging the war. Western military to Ukraine is quote unquote prolonging the war, and if we can just kind of will negotiations and a ceasefire into being without there's often a very careful avoidance of what a ceasefire would look like and what the terms would have to be, and because realistically that would just mean accepting continued Russian occupation of large parts of Ukraine. I do think there's something worth addressing here, which is like that he's not completely wrong about the fact that and I don't think there's anything constitutionally about even Putin that would make him incapable of negotiating given certain circumstances. Unfortunately, the circumstances in this case are that Putin has basically staked his entire political future on this war, and after whipping the population up into believing that this is a just war and that Russia is he himself cast this as an existential war for Russia, and therefore it must be fought. And he has not really left himself many avenues to back down without plausibly declaring some kind of victory. And so I think actually, and this is why, even though Prigozhin is as much of a bastard as Putin, possibly even worse, Prigozhin doesn't have the same. I think why some people who obviously would never support Prigozhin were nevertheless somewhat hopeful at the possible victory of him managing to overthrow Putin, because Prigozhin doesn't have the same constraints. Prigozhin didn't stake his entire political future on the war. You could see even in the statements he made that he criticized the very basis, the very decision to invade in 2022, implying that if someone else were in charge, they could have found another way. They could have, this wasn't necessary. So yes, I definitely think there is this fake idea among the left that pro-Ukrainian leftists are just opposed to negotiations or a ceasefire in principle, and that's simply not true. It's just that any realistic assessment of the situation does not see any willingness from Putin to, except for these games he plays where he makes statements to the African delegation or to the UN that Russia is always ready to negotiate, but there's never any concrete proposals, and certainly no talk of Russia suspending military operations or retreating from areas that it's occupying. So it's like negotiations under what circumstance?
Well, I think that one of the things that needs to be brought up with reference to Zhelazhenko is the fact that he is the darling source for everyone who's been calling for the partition of Ukraine, and I say the phrase partition of Ukraine because I think it's really important that we be honest and clear and transparent in the language that we're using. When you say peace deal, what you're actually talking about is the partition of Ukraine. That is clear. I mean, that is already that is state policy in Russia. Those territories of Ukraine belong to Russia. They are Russian. Under the Russian constitution, Russian law, Russian civil administration, et cetera, that is part of Russia. So therefore, any negotiation means the partition of Ukraine or some portion of Ukraine. Now, there are some people who absolutely make the argument, and it's fine. They want to make the argument that partitioning Ukraine is preferable to the continuation of this conflict in its current form or in a potentially escalated form at some point in the future, right? Fine, people can make that argument, but generally speaking, that's not the argument you hear from those sections of the left. They posture as being voices for peace, anti-war, etc., when the reality is, in any other situation, they would not be demanding the invaded country lay down its arms. They don't make such demands of Houthis in Yemen. They don't make such demands of Palestinians in West Bank or Gaza. They don't make such demands of, I mean, if we want to go backwards decades, of the North Vietnamese army or whatever, right? You don't make those demands in most situations. What's the difference? The difference is, of course, the United States and the position of the United States here, right? So this is part of the problem. And I mean, I could think of a number of examples of this, but I wrote a whole piece excoriating Medea Benjamin and that book, The War in Ukraine. The only Ukrainian source they used was Zhelazhenko, the only one. And I read the whole fucking book, the whole thing. I wrote a whole piece on that garbage, right? And the reason I call it garbage is because it completely ignores the actual politics of Ukraine, mostly because the authors don't know the first fucking thing about it. And they wrote a whole book peddling to the left the idea that the only course in Ukraine is partition or peace negotiations, right? Well, I'm in favor of peace negotiations too, but under what terms, under what conditions, and with what goal in mind? Because even partitioning Ukraine does not resolve the root causes of this conflict. And that's part of the real issue here. Most of the people that make such arguments and rely on Zhelazhenko as their source and their quote, they don't actually know the first fucking thing about why this war was waged, what's going on, who's being enriched, at what cost. They don't know any of it. They don't know anything about Donbass, how it came to be, what happened in 2014, what's going on there now. They don't know anything about any of it.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I think Ron sums it up pretty well in his comment. Yeah, Russia has no intention of leaving Crimea and its annexed territories, and Ukraine has no intention of giving them up. So that's like the idea that this constant repetition of I have an idea. Let's call for a ceasefire negotiations as if this is something new. Like, yeah, it says nothing. Um, so yeah,
I think that again, I also would like to see an end to the war. But
right.
what I don't want to see is an end to this war that creates a multi-decade conflict that goes on and on and on for generations. And that is essentially the direction that this is headed. Now, clearly, there is such significant instability within the Russian state that may not last for that long. And this is where I kind of want to take the conversation now. One of the interesting things about this, Alex, is sort of let's call it the positioning, the political positioning here, because for a long time already, there's really only been one true national figure in Russia other than Putin politically, and that's Navalny. And of course, Navalny's in jail. He's sort of the cause celeb of liberal opposition and, Western countries and so forth. And there have been elements to Putin's right. There have been, right, with different positions, right? People like Dugin or whomever, right, who spout even more openly imperial revanchist rhetoric, who have an ideological framework that is even more conservative and reactionary than Putin. But none of them are actual political figures. Now we have Prigozhin presents himself as maybe he's not a viable alternative, but he is an alternative. He's not Putin. He's to Putin's right. And so now there is, in a weird way, this sort of de facto situation where Putin does actually have something representing like an opposition on his left and his right, which hasn't happened ever, really.
Yeah, I think that's true. Actually, earlier today, I was listening to the Radio War Nerd podcast, who I've often disagreed with their takes on Russia and Ukraine, but they do have some pretty good analysis sometimes. They kind of noted that Prigozhin was sort of almost picking up the mantle of Navalny, but from the populist right instead of the populist kind of liberal. And I mean, with also the asterisk that Navalny in his past has also been, courted Russian nationalists, and Prigozhin, the sort of stuff he has been saying in his video addresses and the kind of criticisms he's been making, where he's not only criticizing the military establishment, but also the elites, and that their children are partying on beaches and in Europe, while it's only the poor Russian families' children who are dying, and that they're just sending our boys into the meat grinder just to pad their wallets, like that kind of rhetoric. It's distinctly a kind of like right populist rhetoric. It's also something that has been around in Russia for a while via the kind of controlled, allowed opposition. Particularly, very much reminded me of the recently departed Vladimir Zhirinovsky.
Oh shit! He died.
Yeah, he
When
died.
did he die?
Actually, he died shortly before the invasion, which is
Get out of here! Whoa, we're gonna pour one out for that piece of shit. Go ahead.
right.
Yeah, I think I remember my grandma telling me an anecdote about Zhirinovsky when he was asked about his family lineage, and he said because his mother was, I think his mother was Christian and his father was Jewish, and he said, "Oh, my mother was a Christian, and my father is a lawyer."
It's great. It's even better in Russian because
Yeah.
what he said was my mama ruskaya, my papa yurist, which
jurist, yes.
But it sounds a lot like the Russian word for Jew, which is yuvrei.
Yuvrei. Yeah.
There's a bit of a pun there. It's he was a very funny guy, very clever, sort of a proto kind of Berlusconi Trump figure. But yeah, during Putin's reign, he led the Liberal Democratic Party, which was a sort of perennial opposition party that was sort of not a real opposition because pretty much supported most of Putin's policies. Often their only criticism was that they didn't go far enough to the right, that they should be more to the right. But at the same time, Zhirinovsky would often have these rants where he would voice these kind of discontents about, the neglected provinces and the class divide and the the elite oligarchs. Of course, also while being one, just like Prigozhin, right? I mean, it's not like
naturally.
Yeah, right. So yeah, I think Prigozhin definitely was drawing on a lot of that.
I want to point out something else to you, Alex. I mean, I think if you're a real Russia watcher, then you probably know Kevin Rothrock on Twitter, Kevin Rothrock of Medusa, important Russian news outlet. Anyway, he had tweeted something that I thought was it was funny, but also actually kind of incisive. It was a screenshot of Prigozhin's audio that he released today, the recording that he released today on his Telegram. And Rothrock noted the almost perfectly even split between fire emoji reactions and clown face emoji reactions, and that it was almost quite literally 50-50, right? And it's kind of amusing, but it also, I think, actually does illustrate something, that Russia really is divided here in terms of between those. I'm not talking, of course, about the left and progressives and liberals so much, who have really opposed the war, but I mean among the bulk of society, the 65 to 75% of Russia that has more or less supported tacitly or overtly the war, there seems to be a very clear divide between Prigozhin is the only one with balls, which is how Prigozhin has presented himself, versus Prigozhin's a traitor. So what do you think that says? I mean, I have to believe that divide is apparent to a lot of people, including U.S. intelligence, Ukrainian intelligence, etc., right? They're going to play on this, of course, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think it's really interesting. There's just like, if I had to, and I mean, a lot of this is just guesswork at this point. If I had to guess, I think I would say that the people calling him a traitor are the more kind of hardened ideologues who might really buy into this idea of basically the sort of ideological sort of construct that Putin's been attempting to build for his this idea as Russia as the bastion of traditional values versus versus the decadent West, all that kind of stuff, and then then this idea of the motherland and Prigozhin as a traitor. I think Prigozhin does enjoy a lot of appeal, sort of populist appeal among kind of what we were saying before, like the sort of cynical people who they might believe some of that, they might not. It's not really a big deal for them. They just kind of go about their day, but what they do admire, and then sort of the same way a lot of you see this in a lot of support for these kinds of populist strongmen all over the world. Berlusconi, Trump, like this idea that oh yeah, even if I don't agree with him and think he's a clown, I like that he has balls. I like that he speaks directly. So I think that is I would say it's even less of like a political divide than like a vibes divide almost.
Yeah. And I also think that it raises very serious questions about the resilience of the state here, right? I mean, how can it be that they got so far so quickly? I think, and this is, I'd like to get your take on this. I think that Prigozhin didn't expect this. I don't think Prigozhin expected it to go like the way that it did. I don't think he expected just roll through hundreds of kilometers. I don't think he expected to get that close to Moscow. I don't think he expected to be in a position to actually carry out a coup d'etat. Yeah. That this seemed like a stunt that maybe kind of got out of control because the weakness of the state. I mean, it's shocking, right? And
yeah, which makes this so comical. It's like Prigozhin is like the dog chasing the fire truck that has no idea what to do with the fire truck once he has it in sight. Yeah, I do, because I don't think Prigozhin was not equipped to march on Moscow, and Moscow actually would have been well defended, to some extent. And
so Alex, did you know that among the red, brown, right wing, left wing weirdo world where everything Russian is good and everything, Ukraine is bad or whatever, in that world, Prigozhin was a hero. And then 24 hours later, Prigozhin worked for the CIA and the Mossad. And now Prigozhin is maybe just a traitor. So what do you think it'll be 24 hours from now?
Oh no, there's already a new one. It's this was all a brilliant feint because now Wagner is in Belarus and positioned to attack Ukraine from the north,
Ah,
and this was
yes.
all part of
Ah, yes, the
these chess.
brilliant tactical strategy of
Yeah.
humiliating yourself and undermining your entire power structure. Of course.
Yeah. This was quite a weekend for them. Um, yeah, I think the gray zone folks have been surprisingly quiet. I don't
Well,
really
that
follow them.
I think that's obvious why they would be.
Yeah.
Well, what do you make of? Oh, well, actually, I should put this one up. Thanks, Nick, for that. Nick was the one who had asked a question about Sheleznyenko. So I think that was an important subject to discuss as well. So thanks for that, Nick. Well, let me put this one up as well. I don't speak Russian, but don't you all think that Prigozhin may be pushing the Russian military to be more aggressive in Ukraine? What do you think, Alex?
Um, I mean, well, I guess what I would sort of ask what you mean by more aggressive. I think mostly with what he's been repeating time after time in all his video addresses is that he's been demanding more supplies and more funding and ammunition for his troops, who are presumably, following, the battle plan and, tasked with taking, they took Bakhmut finally after a year or so. But I don't know that Prigozhin is pushing for some kind of more aggressive overall strategy. In fact, the thing is, these people talk out both sides of their mouths. He can say one thing this week, and he can say something else the next week. But uh, he very openly criticized the entire plan behind the war and the entire concept and the overall strategy. So I don't think he's necessarily someone like Igor Girkin, who, by the way, was one of those, like when I talked about the ideologues who really believe in this like traditional imperialist vision of Russia as the motherland, and wanted Prigozhin, demanded Prigozhin's head as a traitor. Igor Girkin was definitely one of those people. He's definitely like one of the true believers. Um,
And just for background for listeners and viewers, Igor Girkin, also known as Strelkov, is one of the colonels from the Russian apparatus that was part of the 2014 infiltration into Donbass. He has taken credit publicly for being the person who helped to foment the war, and he has become a virulent right-wing critic of the war effort, basically pretty much every day saying that Putin and Russia really screwed this up and they should have just smashed Ukraine, and if he was in charge he would have. So
yeah, and what Yurkin's been pushing for since 2014 was a full scale, fully committed military invasion, mobilize the whole population if you have to. Um, and so Gierkin has been consistent. His criticism was always that the military is not doing enough. Putin is not militarizing society enough. They're not committing enough power to this. Prigozhin, I don't think, has the same incentives or the same goals. Like Prigozhin's looking out for his own skin. He's looking out for Wagner. He's looking out for getting his men more supplies, getting himself more profit, lining his own pocketbook. So yeah,
we had several people on the live stream a couple of days ago when this was first happening, who had made the argument, which I've definitely not accepted. I didn't accept it then, and I still don't. But I suppose it's possible. The argument that this was staged, right? That this whole thing was staged for the purposes of, I don't know, whatever, right? This is also one thing that I think needs to be addressed. It's always possible. Of course, the Russians know how to carry out, these kinds of sort of propaganda stunts, but on this scale and with these outcomes, it does, to me at least, it makes no sense, there is so little gain and so much to lose for Putin and for the power structure that I cannot believe that this would have been staged. But I do think that it's important to at least address that. So what do you think about that argument?
Yeah, like I just find it hard to take seriously because also like it's sort of staged by who, to paraphrase Lenin, staged by who to do what. If you don't have like at least a theory of that, then sort of saying it's staged doesn't really say anything. I mean, but this, I think this idea that it does sort of speak to Russia is like this one of the most postmodern countries in the world, ironically, because there is just such a, also civil society is completely demobilized. Everything happens through these carefully like stage managed press conferences, like when supposedly when was it when Shoigu was like delivering some military decision to Putin, and they filmed them like as if Shoigu is telling him to him for the first time, and Putin is like countermanding the order. And it's a lot of Russian politics is this kind of stage theater, and that includes these video addresses that Prigozhin has been filming. So in a way, it's actually true that this was staged because Prigozhin did this as a publicity stunt, taking like live streaming himself with a selfie the whole time. So yes, of course it was staged, but the idea that Putin was somehow in on it is you need a lot of it takes a lot of credulity to sort of stack the sort of conditions under which this would benefit Putin in any way at all. I think I saw some theories that it was like Putin actually wants to get rid of Shoigu, and this gives him an excuse to fire Shoigu for like the incompetence and for not being able to stop the advance. But like,
because he needed that, right? He
right. Why would Putin just fire Shoigu? Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sense in which, like, yes, this was staged because pretty much everything that happens in Russian politics is staged. But the idea that it was orchestrated by Putin is just, I don't find any reason to believe that.
My friend Vahak is checking in. Hey, Vahak, that's giving Putin way too much credit. Agreed. Vahak agreed.
Yeah. Oh, you're muted again.
Oh, sorry. Yep, sorry. What do you think about Prigozhin's feelings on the military? Do you think that he expected military defections? Because if there had been low-level military defections, at the sort of rank and file level, this may have turned into something a bit more serious.
I think I thought I saw some reports that there were, I guess, if not defections, then at least like the soldiers that were along the checkpoints just sort of standing down or even cheering Wagner on.
Yeah, but it was minimal. It was minimal. The defections were minimal. You didn't see mass defections. You didn't see whole, brigades or, divisions, moving over to Prigozhin, which is one of the things that you would really need to carry out a coup.
Yeah, I think I don't have the names on hand, but there were Prigozhin did have some allies in among sort of Putin's inner circle that I think one of them actually came out pretty strongly against the march, and I think maybe that like I said before, I think Prigozhin maybe was probing and hoping that if more of the oligarchs or even other military leaders besides Shoigu and Gerasimov had sort of signaled some kind of support, that maybe he would have gone farther. But and I think without that, this becomes like Prigozhin has a lot of sort of available options to like explain what the purpose of this was. Right, this could have just been. And everyone, this is a cliche by now, but there's a reason. Like everyone has used this framing who's been talking about this, the sort of classic Russian narrative of the Tsar is good, the boyars are bad. So this is not a rebellion against the Tsar. This is like an appeal to get the Tsar's attention, to get him to dismiss the corrupt, bad advisors and nobles around him.
Classic Russia.
Yeah.
All right, going back to what I mentioned about Kevin Rothrock's tweet, I thought this was good. I got it. So let's take a look at that. After about 14 hours, here's the Telegram audience response to Prigozhin's rather long audio post. You can see 138,000 fire emoji responses and 137,000 clown responses. So I mean, I guess that's the point, right? Prigozhin
We
is the
got some,
definition of divisive here.
we got some poop emojis.
Yeah, well, and I don't know what the bananas mean either. So, but in any case, all right. So, what do you make of what's coming next, Alex? I mean, stare into your crystal ball for a minute, based on what you know about Russia, Russian media, Russian culture, Russian society, Russian politics. What do you expect in the coming days, weeks?
I mean, if there's one thing I know about Russia, it's like not to make predictions, but with that in mind, I mean, I think the involvement of Lukashenko really kind of adds a whole other interesting twist to this, because that's been another part of the drama, which is that, like, contrary to sort of like really simplistic Western narratives where Lukashenko is just like Putin's obedient puppet, there has been a lot of tension over the decades that both of them have been in power, where I mean, Lukashenko doesn't want Belarus to just be absorbed into Russia because he's president of Belarus. He needs at least a nominally independent Belarus in order to maintain his own power. But over the years, he's sort of pretty cleverly, I would say, played the game. Sort of the same game that Yanukovych was very ineptly trying to play, of like making promises to both Russia and the West, playing them off against each other, extracting sort of concessions from both. There was a while in the 2010s that he was seen to be moving kind of towards the West.
Yeah, and he had a falling out with Putin several times, including over, all kinds of things, Belarusian subsidy or Belarusian exports and the subsidies for those exports. Belarus exported a lot of dairy products and other things to Russia that they were supposed to be paid for, and they weren't. So there was a lot going on where Belarus was looking at China, looking at getting in on the Belt and Road and moving away from the Russians and closer to China, moving away closer to Europe, etc. But really, all of that pretty much came to a crashing halt in 2020 with the protest movement in Belarus, and Putin basically bailed him out. And at that point, Lukashenko is in Putin's pocket, pretty much. So it is interesting, and I think this is another layer of humiliation for Putin, that he had to go to Lukashenko rather than the other way around, which is the traditional sort of colonial, fealty kind of relationship.
Right. So, and that kind of raises and opens up another question, like, what's Lukashenko's angle in this, and is he using this to get back some of that leverage that he lost in 2020? And now, incidentally, he has a significantly large, or at least the leader of a significantly large military force under his, protection or custody, or so remains to be seen. I mean, there's a very good chance that Prigozhin falls out of a window next week or something, right? I think the sort of the interplay between not just these two parties, but these three parties of Putin, Prigozhin, Lukashenko, and then whatever other figures are kind of waiting in the wings in Russia. And it's really kind of anyone's guess, because there's sort of, you can kind of game out if Prigozhin actually survives this, and then there's the next question right now. I think the most immediate thing is, are the Wagner troops, are they going to be absorbed into the ministry, under the command of the Ministry of Defense, like as originally planned, which was kind of one of the things that sparked this? Or is Prigozhin not only going to get to keep his life and freedom, but is he somehow going to actually maintain command of his 25,000 or whatever strong army? So that, I think that's the immediate kind of thing. And then whether but there's definitely a question of also what signal this sends to the sort of oligarch circle that to this day has sort of remained reliant on Putin, even if they may be sort of privately unhappy with how the war has like affected their profits. Because what you've seen now is that one takeaway from this is that you can literally march a private army within striking distance of Moscow, kill official uniformed Russian servicemen, and get away with it as a kind of misunderstanding. And actually, this is now a legitimate means of getting the ruler's attention and negotiating with the government. Yeah.
I think that in the couple of minutes we have remaining, I think it would be important to mention the impact here of these developments on what you might call Russia's sort of neo-colonial presence via Wagner, because of course Wagner provides quote unquote security for the military junta government in Mali, for the military junta that is in control of Sudan, for both sides actually of the conflict in Sudan, to be perfectly honest. The government in Central African Republic, in Mozambique, in a number of other countries where the Wagner forces have been quite effectively extracting precious metals, resources, other things to enrich Prigozhin and enrich themselves, but also enriching the Russian state. This is one of the ways that Russia has evaded the deepest parts of the impact of sanctions by, stealing Sudanese gold and, getting mining concessions on the Mali-Ghana border and other things like that brings in billions and billions of dollars. So with Prigozhin now potentially out and Wagner questionable, what does this mean for Russia's position in places like Africa? Because so much of Russia's diplomatic posture on Ukraine is predicated on global South countries not taking a side, or taking Russia's side, or more often than not taking a side, which is kind of tacitly taking Russia's side. So this raises a very interesting question. U.S. and French neo-colonial forces must be licking their lips watching this. The French were ejected from Mali, where they were the traditional colonial power. The Russians replaced them. The Central African Republic, the same. Burkina Faso, the same. You see this in a lot of places. Russia had been talking about a ridiculous notions that they were going to foster a confederation of Sahel states in Africa. I mean, all of this crazy shit, right? None of that, of course, was ever going to happen. But now that Wagner is basically, for lack of a better word, sort of a defunct organization in and of itself, what does this mean for Russia in Africa? What does it mean for Russia's international diplomatic situation? And what does it mean for Africa vis-a-vis the West?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ball is kind of still up in the air. I'm not sure if Wagner is actually defunct. Last I heard, the one of their offices had been raided, and they found like millions of rubles there that Prigozhin said were going to be used to pay his troops, but they haven't like shut. And as far as I know, the office in St. Petersburg is still operating. And yeah, I mean, this is a thing that's under discussed. The Wagner is not just a private military force; they're a sprawling multinational network of like shell companies and doing everything from like mining to financial operations to like the troll farm, the internet research agency. So, and I mean, the funny thing is, these were set up specifically in a way to evade sanctions and make it very hard to shut them down, because it's a series of shell companies. A lot of them are not even held by Prigozhin, but like by members of his family. So, and they've been able to like to some extent to skirt Western sanctions via that. It would be very funny now if Russia started scrambling to shut down Wagner, but found it hard to do so for those very same reasons. But that's just speculating. I don't know if that's. I think it would, in any circumstance, be very difficult because of the whole reason Wagner was set up and put into those places is because it was places where the Russian state couldn't really operate. The Russian state can't really, or at least it would look bad even to their host nations population. For the Russian state officially directly to be controlling mines in Central African Republic and uh, various companies or providing security to like
it's also bad. It's also bad optics, really, because there's an economic crisis inside of Russia, and there's a lot of talk always, even back in the Soviet days, about how much are we spending in Africa and in Asia and all these places when our roads are dilapidated, our schools are underfunded, and all of this stuff. So there is a political component to that as well. And I would also say that Russia has shown its extreme limitations in terms of what its military can actually do. And I don't think Russia wants to see, 24 of its fighters ambushed by the Islamic State in Mali and massacred and dumped into a grave, right? When it's Wagner forces, like, who cares? They don't exist. They're not real people. They don't have names. They don't have families, right? But when it's Russian military, that could be also politically dicey for them. And again, it also raises the question about those governments. They're all the ones that I named are on very, very shaky footing. I mean, the military junta in Mali is hanging on. Basically, their entire grip on power is guaranteed by Wagner. So, even a moderate drawdown then raises the question of, are the coup junta going to get couped themselves, right? That Wagner is the sort of coup insurance policy that they've been using in Sudan. So this again raises that question. And I go back to what I said a moment ago about France and the United States and the British and the other traditional colonial powers in Africa who saw Russia and Wagner as a very vexing problem in recent years. And now all of a sudden it looks like those countries may come crawling back to the traditional imperialists.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I think definitely this poses either way. This poses a problem for Russia's sort of kind of neo-colonial interests in the global South. And again, yeah, this is just so much still a developing thing that could change literally at any moment.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they reported 4 hours ago that Prigozhin's plane was seen leaving Belarus and flying back to Moscow. So, who knows what that means? Or that one of his planes was going to Moscow and another was going to St. Petersburg. Maybe the third one is going to Tahiti for him. I don't know.
Yeah.
All right, so we're pretty much out of time. Ron, thank you for the comment there. Thanks for the great discussion. Really appreciate that one, Ron. Listeners, viewers, as always, thank you for watching, for listening. Go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. Have a lot more stuff like this. I've done several live streams with some comrades in the last few days. More to come, more other videos of just me, talking and so forth. Alex, you should be following Alex Gendler on social media. And of course, as always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Peace. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.